Welcome to the Human Rights Podcast series of Freedom of Assembly, Freedom of Expression, and Rights Defenders in Turkey. I'm Beril Eski. Throughout the 3 episodes of this podcast series, produced with the support of the Association for Monitoring Equal Rights, the Truth, Justice and Memory Center, and the Netherlands Helsinki Committee, and in collaboration with Kısa Dalga Media, we will facilitate a better understanding of human rights in Turkey. We will be exploring the situation of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and rights defenders, joined by prominent academics and human rights advocates.
Oku, dinle, izle. Kısa Dalga.
In this 3rd episode of the podcast series, produced with the support of the Association for Monitoring Equal Rights, the Truth, Justice, Memory Center, and the Netherlands Helsinki Committee, and in collaboration with Kısa Dalga Media, we will be facilitating a better understanding of the situation of human rights defenders in Turkey, joined by Emma Sinclair Webb. Sinclair Webb is Human Rights Watch's Turkey director, and she's a passionate human rights advocate. Emma, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So our first question is, who is a rights defender? Are there any standards, international standards, to define human rights defenders?
Well, yes, the term human rights defender it was one that was actually introduced with a declaration on human rights defenders by the United Nations. And that declaration was published in 1998. And the full name of the declaration is the Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And that's a very long title, so it's always abbreviated to the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And this declaration really lays out what a human rights defender is and the value of promoting human rights in a country. So it has 3 central sort of pillars to the declaration, which is about recognizing the value and important contribution of rights defenders to peace, sustainable development, and human rights in a country. So states have an obligation to recognize the value of these people involved in rights defense. And then it also introduces the idea that you have to respect human rights defenders and not discriminate against them, not basically have reprisals against them for their activities which are legitimate. So it calls on states to uphold the right of human rights defenders to do their job. And then it also asks states to create an enabling environment through laws and other steps to promote a public understanding of human rights and of respect for human rights in the country. So, and that includes education about human rights, for example, and national institutions that uphold human rights, and those can be public state institutions as well. So this declaration on human rights defenders goes back to 1998. And really, from that point on, the term defender became more widespread, replacing other terms like activist and monitor, which had been also used. And then we have another very important guideline on human rights defenders from the EU, and that was brought in 2004. It basically repeats much of what the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders says. But we can come back also in this description of what human rights defenders are to actually the definition, because it's a very wide definition. Basically, the UN says very expansively that it's anyone who defends civil and political rights, but also economic, social and cultural rights, and that it takes many forms, human rights defense. It can be focused on ethnic rights, minority rights, gender, sexual orientation, class, economic situation, women's rights, children's rights, disability rights, right to health, housing, food. Trade unionists are counted as human rights defenders. Sometimes journalists are counted too, because they do a lot of rights work in their journalism. And lawyers, of course, and even public officials and politicians are counted by the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders as human rights defenders. And that's perhaps not always known. Most people assume that human rights defenders are generally part of non-governmental groups and part of civil society, and not part of public bodies or state institutions or political parties. But some of the activities by public officials and politicians counts as human rights defense.
So as you've explained, it's a very broad term and it replaces other terms as well. But I'm still wondering, this popular term, activist. So I'm still wondering if there are any differences between being a human rights defender and being an activist.
Well, I think this is a question of the term human rights defender, as I said, was brought in with the UN Declaration. But activist is a term widely used, and I think activist is even more expansive because with activist, we also are talking about political activists. So they could be politicians, people in political parties, members of political parties, who explicitly are not counted as distinctly as human rights defenders, even though some of their activities too could be promoting human rights.
Human rights defenders are protected by international conventions and declarations. And who is responsible for protecting them?
Well, the responsibility in the end, of course, comes down to the state and the government in each country concerned. So the thing about the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and the EU guidelines on human rights defenders is that they're not hard law, they're not international law, they are guidelines, they are recommendations, if you like, but they draw on lots of international law instruments and conventions and treaties like the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights from the UN, and they uphold, basically they bring in the rights that are enshrined in law in those conventions and make them part of protection of human rights defenders' own rights. But in the end, it's down to the state to protect human rights defenders, but it isn't wired into hard international law. It's more in terms of guidelines and the declaration. One thing I should add is that one of the prerequisites of being a human rights defender is that your activities are conducted peacefully. It's peaceful activity that counts as human rights defense in all of these guidelines. So really, coming back to your question, yes, it's the state that is responsible for protecting human rights defenders. And as we see all over the world, it's mostly the state that doesn't protect human rights defenders.
And that's what I was going to ask you, because it seems a little contradictory because, the states are posing threats in many cases. And on the other hand, states are responsible for protecting them.
That is indeed the paradox, and I think it's absolutely evident over the last few years in Turkey that this has become a really pressing problem. And I know we're going to talk about some of the cases and some of the individuals who have been most targeted for their human rights work. But it really has become an acute problem in Turkey in the last, I would say, 6 years.
Yeah, let's talk about Turkey then. Maybe talk about some prominent names. Eren Keskin, Şebnem Korur Fincancı, or other names you want to talk about. What they do, how they work, what are the issues they're working on, advocating on?
Well, when we come to a figure like Eren Keskin, who's had, a 30-year experience of working on human rights, very much associated with the Human Rights Association, which is Turkey's oldest human rights organization, an NGO, we see that Eren Keskin has, over her career as a human rights lawyer, been targeted for many years. And we've always worked on her cases. I previously worked for Amnesty, and Eren Keskin was somebody very widely known among Amnesty members and widely respected around the world for her extraordinary activism around women's rights and protecting the rights of women in detention, doing a very pioneering project on tracking sexual violence against women in detention, so rape in custody, and probably one of the first people to put that issue on the map in Turkey in the late 90s. Eren Keskin has been worked very widely across the span of rights. She's currently the co-chair of the Human Rights Association, which she's been involved in for many, many years. And she faces multiple prosecutions and trials and convictions. And this year, she got, for the first time, a conviction for being a member of a terrorist organization. And Eren herself told me that, this is literally the first time she's been accused of being a member of an armed organization. No one's ever tried to stick that charge on her before. And she actually got a sentence for that, a 6-year, 3-month sentence. And that was in February. And I want to talk a bit about that because in that, the reason Eren got that sentence was because she stood in as the co-editor of Kurdish newspaper, Özgür Gündem, a very well-known newspaper that's existed over decades. And she has been a writer at times for the newspaper, with columns and things, but basically she's been held responsible for all the editorial content of the newspaper, although her role as editor was largely a symbolic role. And Eren, throughout her co-editorship, was actually conducting her work as a lawyer, doing human rights work, and not really working on the newspaper itself. And I think I regard the sentence against Eren, the conviction against Eren, as a direct reprisal for all the other work that she's been associated with. It's not so much of what she's written as, the other work the other activities she's drawn attention to, particularly violations by the security forces, by the police, and rape in custody. And this is a case of, I would say, a reprisal for her entire human rights activity over a very long time. What I want to look at here in Eren Keskin's case is the fact that there is a judgment, the recent judgment on that case of the 6-year, 3-month sentence, talks directly about human rights and makes a strong argument that Eren Keskin and others hid behind human rights and human rights defense and were actually using this as a kind of screen from which to destroy the unity of the state, to destroy public order. So it's actually making a kind of political argument, the recent decision of the court, saying that actually human rights is very often used as a screen for other nefarious activities, particularly terrorism. And I think the theme of the present in Turkey is really to tar human rights defenders with the taint of terrorism. Anything you don't like about what they do, you basically can describe as a plot, as part of a nefarious, suspicious criminal activity which is against the state and aimed at either destroying the unity of the state, and that particularly is applied to Kurdish human rights defenders, or is to do with trying to overthrow the constitutional order or bring down the government. And that's another charge that we see recently applied to people who are actively involved in the defense of human rights. So Eren Keskin's case is interesting because I think we see it very explicitly stated in the court's judgment that human rights is a suspicious activity. And I think we've seen that also in other cases, notably the case of the human rights defender Osman Kawala. Perhaps we can come on to his case later. But, coming back to the other names you mentioned, Şebnem Korur-Fincancı, a doctor, a forensic pathologist, now head of the Turkish Medical Association, and the national body representing doctors and physicians. Şebnem is a very well-known human rights defender in her own right, particularly for her work on being able to diagnose symptoms of torture. She was one of the fundamental figures in drawing up what is called the Minnesota Protocol, which is all about how to treat victims of torture and how to conduct also autopsies and do the kind of work that doctors need to do to provide medical reports in a proper way. And now Şebnem, as soon as she became head of the Medical Association, was described by the President Erdogan as being no more than a terrorist. He made some very defamatory remarks about her, which, actually open her to the possibility of being prosecuted, of being targeted by courts. And we have this pattern in Turkey where the president and senior officials very often speak out publicly against people that they don't like. And that then is followed by either an arrest or some kind of prosecution. We've seen that also in the case of the Human Rights Association more generally. There was the Interior Minister this year spoke out against the Human Rights Association, I think in mid-February. And then, in late March, the co-chair of the Human Rights Association, Öztürk got detained from his home at dawn. That even the detention was broadcast on television. So there were even cameramen with the police during the raid. And we saw pictures of Öztürk, a human rights defender, being marched out of his house in the very early morning. So that's pretty chilling. So I think this brings us back to the point that the state in Turkey is much more interested in undermining the activities of human rights defenders and actually questioning the very principles on which they work by bringing in this label of terrorist at every opportunity.
Well, you talked about the risks they're taking, the human rights defenders in Turkey, mainly prosecution, but also being targeted by the senior officials, the president himself. But are they facing any other risks by being a human rights defender in Turkey? Like Tahir Elçi case, for instance.
Of course. Now, Tahir Elçi was formerly the head of the Diyarbakır Bar Association and a very well-respected human rights lawyer over decades. Tahir Elçi's work for an international audience, it's important to explain, was very much in the 1990s, at the height of the conflict between the PKK and the state. Tahir Elçi documented and worked on cases of enforced disappearances in the southeast of the country and extrajudicial executions, killings, torture, big, egregious human rights abuses in that period. And he took many cases to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a very important contribution to the case law of the European Court on this issue. And I think Tahir Elçi was, really a pioneer of the promotion and protection of human rights for Kurds in the southeast. Years later, he became head of the Bar Association. And during that time, in 2015, after the collapse of a peace process between the PKK and the Turkish state, Tahir Elçi got again involved in human rights monitoring and documentation as head of the bar. And he was in late 2015, he was writing many reports about the rising conflict in the region in different cities, in his own town of Cizre in Şırnak province, also in Nusaybin, in Silvan, in many different towns of the southeast where there were curfews imposed by the state, but also very awful military operations and fighting in the cities because the PKK youth wing had entrenched itself in those towns and was actually conducting its fight from the city centre. I mean, a terribly, terribly mistaken and awful policy at the time. And Tahir Elçi was very clear about condemning the PKK actions, but also condemning the security operations by the state, which were disproportionate and resulted in civilian deaths. Tahir Elçi, after all this work documenting rights, he held a press conference in the center of Diyarbakır, Old City, actually condemning the hostilities, the fighting in the city, and stay away from our historical monuments, stay away from our city centers, stay away from our culture and civilization of hundreds of years. And, civilians should live in peace and be protected in the city centre. And after this press conference, which really actually was condemning both security operations by the state and by the PKK, Tahir Elçi was shot dead because at the very moment the press conference he held finished, there was a shootout between two PKK militants and police. The PKK militants killed two police officers and ran down a small street where Tahir Elçi was making his press statement. And at that moment, as they ran down there, the police were firing at the militants, and Tahir Elçi got shot dead. Now, there's a trial against the police and the militants for his murder. This trial has only just begun. Only 2 hearings have been held of it so far. But it has taken literally 5 years to get to the point of attempting to bring perpetrators to justice and to seek justice for the killing of Tahir Elchi. And I think that shows you the lack of interest in pursuing justice for victims of human rights violations. The terrible, tragic irony in the case of Tahir Elchi is that he was a human rights defender and he lost his life actually for defending human rights. We do not know the full circumstances. There are basically, there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that one of 3 police officers was shooting in the direction of Tahir Elchi and shot Tahir Elchi dead. However, it is for the court to decide whether that was a tragic mistake, whether that was an intentional killing, or whether it was something else, and whether the bullet came from somewhere else. And 2 of the militants are also on trial, though it looks like they were not shooting at the time Tahir Elchi was hit. And we have substantial work actually reconstructing the last moments before Tahir Elchi died by an organisation in London called Forensic Architecture, which actually points to the fact that this is very likely to have been a police bullet. But this is an ongoing trial now, and we hope that the court will do its job and justice will be served.
Would it be fair to say that the pressure on human rights defenders are increasing in Turkey?
For sure, the pressure on human rights defenders is getting worse. And I think going back to the 2 examples we started with, which was Eren Keskin and actually Öztürk Tukdoğan and Şebnem Korur Fincancı, just the kinds of the state discourse against defenders and the pattern of prosecution has risen in recent times. But we can't talk about that without also talking about the case of Osman Kawala and the case of the human rights defenders who became known as the Istanbul 10 plus 1 in the end, who attended a human rights training on the island of Büyükada off Istanbul and got arrested and jailed for some period, but also put on trial for terrorism. That's a very important case. So all of these cases are from the last 5 years. And I think it really does show us that there is an escalating pressure against defenders.
Oku, dinle, izle. Kısa Dalga.
On July 5th, 2017, Turkish police raided a digital security workshop on Büyükada Island, one of the Princess Islands off the coast of Istanbul, that was organized by local human rights organizations in cooperation with Amnesty International Turkey's branch. 10 activists arrested that day, while Taner Kılıç, who was already facing other charges, was summarily added as a co-defendant in this case. What we saw in this case was lack of evidence, for sure, but also it was really easy to associate the defendants with terrorism and espionage charges. How is that possible? How can you associate human rights defenders with these serious charges so easily?
Well, yes, I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. You go to a regular human rights training on an island, in a hotel, just a workshop, and that workshop becomes targeted as a kind of evidence of a plot against the state, if you like. The charges, in fact, and the evidence is non-existent in this case. I mean, and it's quite an absurd case. But the absurdity of it is, of course, you can sit back and laugh at it, but this had real terrible implications for those involved. When you look at the 10 defendants who were on court on that island doing their human rights education workshop, it might seem quite surreal and bizarre that they could be targeted in such a way. The effect of the Büyükada case, the case of the Istanbul 10 defenders who were arrested during their workshop, it has had a profound effect because among those 10, were local human rights defenders working in very different areas who probably mostly all knew each other. And there were people from the local branch of Amnesty International, in particular the former director of Amnesty International's Turkey branch. And I think the effect of being arrested, held for several months in detention before being released and put through this really abusive trial in which there really was no evidence, and there were these really surreal court proceedings that were quoting all sorts of bogus evidence and calling it, describing it as, evidence of terrorism. I mean, the effect on those people has been profound. I mean, several have left the country and have made new lives overseas. Two of them were anyway nationals of other countries. One was Swedish, one was German. Of course, they went back to Sweden and Germany. But some of the Turkish nationals who were among that in that trial, well-known names, have also left the country and made new lives abroad. And that's a really tragic thing, that people feel they have to leave their country because they've been put through this incredibly abusive process, which has basically stopped them in their tracks from doing their human rights work, their activism, their peaceful work, which is actually all about trying to promote greater rights for citizens of Turkey. But you find yourself in your own country described as a traitor and stigmatized, ostracized, and really forced out of your activities, and even feeling you have to leave the country. The threat of the possibility of going back to prison has, for many people, been just too much. And that's entirely understandable. Why should someone have to feel that at any moment they can be arrested at dawn from their house when they've done absolutely nothing to merit it? So that trial is an important one. And, really it's very difficult for the former chair of Amnesty Turkey, Taner Kılıç, who's a lawyer in Izmir, because Taner got a conviction as a member of a terrorist organization after that trial. And, if his conviction is upheld by the top court, he will lose his license as a lawyer, be unable to function as a lawyer in Turkey. Now, obviously, we hope very much that that will be overturned, because there is no evidence against Taner Kılıç or against any of the others of any criminal activity. So it is a landmark trial. And after that trial, we saw the targeting of another human rights defender, just months later, Osman Kawala, who remains in Silivri prison, where he's been for the last 3.5 years. And his case, perhaps there's an even greater injustice there because of the length of the detention. And the detention, which is endlessly prolonged on the grounds with new charges, new bogus charges against him, an attempt to extend the trial against him. He's blamed for organising and financing the Gezi Park protests of 2013. He's also accused of involvement in the 15th of July 2016 coup attempt. He's also involved in allegedly in espionage. The charges go on and on against Osman Kawala. And actually, Osman Kawala's activities were, I think, squarely in the defense of human rights. He runs from prison an association called, a non-government group called Anadolu Kültür, which very much promotes rights and justice in Turkey through arts, through cultural production, looks at facing the past, at Turkey confronting its own history, and aims to bring a more equitable Turkey and a more democratic Turkey. That's very much the point of the work of Anadolu Kültür. And we see, just as Osman Kavala has been targeted, Anadolu Kültür has also been described in indictments as a civil society group that's actually promoting treacherous separatist activity. And so the last one of the indictments we've seen has said that Anadolu Kültür's work defends minority rights, that this is a suspect activity, that this is damaging to the Turkish state, and even accuses foreign funders and donors of being involved in a kind of nefarious activities by supporting Osman Kavala's civic group, Anadolu Kültür. So another case of a court making a strong argument that human rights defense is in fact nefarious criminal activity.
Osman Kawala is a businessman, but he's well known as as a civil society figure. You can even say a civil society leader. And what I understand is that he's targeted because of his work in civil society. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that Osman Kawala has been targeted because of his work in civil society. He, he ran Anadolu Kultur and still runs it from prison. And it's an organization that actually is all about promoting a more democratic and peaceful Turkey in the future by looking at Turkey's history, by confronting the past, by promoting arts and cultural production, by remembering the history of minorities in Turkey and, the highly pluralistic past that Turkey had. So I think it's those activities, certainly, and Osman Kavala''s work with NGOs and, in general, his network within civil society, in connection also with international regional groups working on human rights type issues, has definitely brought him to the attention of the Turkish authorities. The idea that he could be blamed for the Gezi Park protests is very far-fetched. There's no causal link between what happened in Gezi Park and Osman Kavala''s own activities. It's quite impossible that Osman Kavala and 15 others could have plotted and planned the Gezi Park protests to happen and to spread all over the country. And yet Osman Kawala and 15 others are being held responsible for everything that happened, the hundreds of thousands of people that went into the streets in 2013, and all any damage to public property that happened in cities throughout the country. So it's absolutely an absurd charge. And I think, there was a need by President Erdogan to find a scapegoat for the Gezi Park protests, because it's very intolerable for the president to think that there could have been anti-government protests in 2013. So obviously someone organized them. It's not something that could happen spontaneously, the president likes to think. But all the evidence points to it being an utterly spontaneous, unpredictable set of protests that happened back then. So it's really absurd to pin it on these 16 people. But the figurehead, of course, the leader of those 16 is definitely, in the eyes of the president and the eyes of the AKP or senior government officials, Osman Kavala. And we have his name constantly repeated by the president, recently by the interior minister as well. And the European Court of Human Rights has said, the fact that the president kept mentioning Osman Kavala's name, kept saying he was guilty, represents a direct interference in the case and points the way to the court of what decision the authorities of Turkey want to see in that case. And so even when Osman Kavala got acquitted for the Gezi Park protests, he got arrested a day later. There has been every conceivable move to keep him locked up in prison. That has been the entire aim of the government around this case so far. And it is a truly, truly shocking case in a way that I think there is no other case against human rights defenders quite like that case. The European Court of Human Rights called for the immediate release of Osman Kavala last year. But despite that, Turkey has repeatedly flouted that order that he should be released and instead brought new charges against him. And continued the process against him. So, we've tried and we are still trying to advocate for his release all the time. But it's a really uphill struggle. And this seems to be a policy of personal revenge against Osman Kawala.
Oku, dinle, izle. Kısa Dalga.
Yeah, it's a unique case for sure compared to other human rights defenders' cases. I also would like to ask you about the level of risks faced by the human rights defenders. Does that change depending on the profile of the human rights defender or the ethnicity? You've briefly mentioned a different approach to Kurdish human rights defenders? Or does it change depending on the incidents, like the coup attempt or other incidents? Can we talk a bit about that?
Well, I think, my instinct would have been, yes, of course, Kurdish human rights defenders get targeted more. Certainly they do. As we've seen with Eren Keskin, Öztürk, others in the southeast who are actually in Diyarbakir. But, coming back to Osman Kawala is what people call a white Turk. He comes from a bourgeois background. He is from Istanbul. And he's been targeted with detention most of all. So I think it's very difficult to totally generalize about this. I think the reason Osman Kawala has been targeted is partly because he was a bridge builder. He was talking to all parts of the society, very interested in the rights of minorities, the rights of Kurds, and unwilling to discuss subjects that are very uncomfortable for the Turkish state. But, in general, yes, those targeted Kurdish rights defenders definitely get targeted with charge of membership of a terrorist organization and get associated completely wrongly with the PKK. And other human rights defenders, Turkish human rights defenders, might not get that charge, but could still get a terrorism charge, including a charge of contact with Gülenists or other left-wing groups, armed left groups. That's all possible too. I think we have in the public discourse of officials a very particularly nasty attitude to women at times, with women rights defenders targeted in government speeches in a pretty unpleasant way. But that is also very much the case for women journalists as well. So I wouldn't say it's only rights defenders. So yes, I'm not sure that I've answered your question on that, but it's a tricky one.
No, I think you did, because it's not just the profile of the subject, the human rights defender, but it's also about the issue they're working on.
I think one of the, and I have to call him a rights defender, we haven't mentioned him till this point, but he really is, for me, one of the most important rights defenders in the country, is Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu. He's a politician from the opposition HDP party, but his work and his background is very much defense of human rights. He worked as the head of Mazlum Der rights organization, which is on the more religious conservative side of the society, but a very important rights group too. And Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu, when he became a member of parliament, made it his mission to stand up for the many victims of human rights violations whose voices are just not heard in Turkey. And many of those are associated with the Gülen movement. And those are people who are, ordinary people, ordinary teachers, housewives, some lawyers, former civil servants, people who've been kicked out of their jobs, who, suffered very, very deep violations after the coup attempt when they were purged from public life in Turkey. And I think, those people were subject to torture. They were subject to this unfair dismissal. They were jailed as terrorists simply because they were in some way associated with the Gülen movement, either through conversation groups or for having a certain bank account or for sending their children to certain schools connected with the Gülen movement. But there was never any evidence in their cases of anything that could or should really be described as terrorism. And yet that was the charge they faced. And I'm not talking here about people who were involved in organizing or actually involved as soldiers in the military coup attempt of 2016. I'm talking about all the ordinary thousands and thousands of ordinary people who got labeled as Gülenists and targeted as termed terrorists overnight because of what had happened in the coup. And so I think it's very important to make a distinction there. And I think Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu has been, an incredibly brave champion of their rights, very outspoken. And that comes not from a position of sympathy with the Gülen movement, but of a very principled look at the violations those people faced. And I think Gergerlioğlu is one of really an incredible defender of human rights, because he really does not focus on what the political orientation of the person is. He looks at the rights, their rights that have been violated, and that's very hard to do in Turkey in a very polarized political context where there's a lot of demonization of political enemies in the country. It's hard to do that without also being accused yourself of associated with the groups whose rights you appear to be defending.
So, how is the Turkish judiciary handling such cases?
Carry on with Gergeroglu. I mean, an incredible thing. They basically, Turkish judiciary, or Turkish authorities, because I don't think it does come from the judiciary, I think it comes from the government. They decided basically on the basis of an old tweet or a retweet that he'd, dating back years, which was all about the Kurdish peace process failing. On the basis of this tweet, they sentenced him, they prosecuted him, sentenced him for terrorist propaganda, and stripped him of his seat in parliament, which is a staggering thing to do. And so we had scenes this year of Ömer Faruk being removed from the parliament and taken to prison. And that, takes us back to the 1990s, to the treatment, of course, also of other HDP politicians in 2016, including Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ and the others. But it's incredible because in the case of Ömer Faruk Gergeroglu, this was really actually a human rights defender who was being removed from parliament. That is the sum of Gergeroglu's political work, is really human rights defense. So coming to your question, I mean, how do prosecutors and courts treat defenders? Well, they do the bidding of the government. When the human rights group in question or the individual gets targeted by government officials, there's always a prosecutor ready to file a case. And very many cases are filed on the basis of old social media postings, tweets, Facebook postings. You can always find something against someone. And I think, all of us working in this area are aware that any of us can face such charges. There's nothing exceptional about it. It's become so routine, banal, standard in Turkey today to find yourself prosecuted for social media postings.
Last but not least, we've talked about the human rights defenders in Turkey and the enormous risks they're facing, the struggles they're having, but it is still a very dynamic climate in terms of human rights defenders, civil society, and new ones are popping up. So I'm wondering how they are motivated to do so, how they are motivating themselves.
I think, the thing about working on Turkey is that you see how very different it is from fossilized authoritarian regimes in Central Asia, in Azerbaijan, other places, Russia to some extent too. In Turkey, you have, yes, an authoritarian governance system. And, obviously over the last period, increasing new allegations about the criminality of the state, of the connection between organized crime and politicians, state officials. So you have all those aspects, but you have a very dynamic society. You have a political opposition, and you have an ability of the society to renew itself. And I think we see this very much in the media, in the creation of new media, that's been very successful in the Turkish case, actually. The old media is now not read. The traditional newspapers, no one looks at. They're controlled by the government, but who cares? No one reads them. But where you've got this dynamic online media, like your own media, podcasts, websites, using social media very vibrantly. And you've got human rights groups and civil society groups that are also responding to the challenges in Turkey and keeping alive issues and keeping ahead, in a way, of the state. And I think it's good to end on that note, because it's not a climate here where everyone is too intimidated to speak, where everyone is being silenced. Yes, terrible things are happening. People are in prison. There are endless prosecutions going on. But I think the fear has somehow gone. And the society, and civil society in particular, is keeping going through this period. I think the trial against the 10 human rights defenders, the Büyükada trial, was enormously intimidating for those people at the time. It was very difficult for Amnesty International's Turkey branch. But despite that, we see that there's been a valiant effort to continue monitoring and documenting rights violations, talking to the media about them, talking to international fora about them, and trying to advocate with the government too. And that's our primary aim, is to also talk to the government. It's very difficult. We're often not listened to. But there are ways of doing it. There are ways of, doing this very legitimate work in scrutinizing the state, in trying to promote a more transparent form of governance. And that is the task of human rights defenders. Shedding a light on the dark side of what the state does will always be a legitimate activity. And I think nobody can take that away from the individuals and groups in Turkey who are engaged in it.
We briefly mentioned it, but Turkey has a very vibrant women and LGBTI movement, right?
Turkey has an extremely vibrant LGBT and women's rights movement. And in fact, the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention has been, in that sense, very counterproductive, because you see the reaction of the women's movement in Turkey and the LGBT movement as well. It's been extremely dynamic. And I think over the past few years, some of the major gains in civil society have come from the LGBT movement, which has organized very effectively. And there is a huge variety of women's rights groups doing different work and working in coalition and on different platforms, collaborating very successfully. I think that is very difficult for the government to get rid of. I think, on the contrary, things are going in a different direction. And, even though we see bans on pride marches, we see ridiculous attempts to stop LGBT panels and legitimate sort of activity by LGBT groups, it hasn't worked, essentially. And the government does a lot of this kinds of stuff. They sort of focused on women's rights and LGBT rights to try to get support from the most conservative part of the society. But, that's also not working. It's very few people are very impressed by the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. That hasn't really resonated. There is an attempt by the government to use this in a part of a cultural war to sort of stoke up its own support. But I don't think it's been productive, really.
Emma Sinclair Webb from Human Rights Watch. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Beril.
Oku, dinle, izle. Kısa Dalga.
Well,